For those in the community, we want to welcome you to Washburn University. For students here, we want to welcome you to the event with Greg Koukl. This is part of our series, the What's the Question series, where we address the questions that deal with the deepest questions of reality and faith. It has been a couple of years since we've had an event here, but because of some new partners with Christian Challenge, we're going to plan on doing an event like this with great speakers as Mr. Koukl on a yearly basis. Our partners, you'll see on the card that you got when you came in, and we are very grateful for Lion and the Lamb Church, Northland Christian Church, Topeka Bible Church, Town and Country Christian Church, and First Southern Baptist Church. This is important for us to address these questions on a regular basis, and for our youth and college students to be able to deal with the most foundational questions of life. No matter our worldview, we must address the most important questions. And that is why I'm thrilled that Mr. Koukl is here today. You'll see again on your card, he is an award-winning writer. He is the author of my favorite book by him, Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair, with Francis Beckwith, and Precious Unborn Human Persons, among many other books. He's published more than 180 articles and has spoken on nearly 70 university and college campuses. I believe this is number 69, here in the United States and abroad. He is an adjunct professor in Christian apologetics at Biola University. He's hosted his own radio talk show for 25 years, advocating clear thinking Christianity and defending the Christian worldview. We will have 1 hour of presentation from Mr. Koukl, dealing with the question, does evil and suffering disprove the goodness of God? And then he's going to open it up for our questions, for your questions. There are microphones that will be on either side. At the end, we'll have you get up and you'll get one question because there will be a number of folks with questions. So as he goes, be thinking about what it is you would like to ask him. Mr. Koukl, thank you so much for coming and being with us here today.
Thanks. Thank you. I said a warm welcome to the Southern California boy. This is my first time in Kansas, and I realize that virtually everything I know about Kansas is probably false because I learned it on The Wizard of Oz. So, I'm still looking for Dorothy. I haven't found her yet. I want you to consider, first of all, the reason that I'm here. I'm here today because my life has been deeply changed by an ancient teacher. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. And gosh, it's 40 years ago when I was a student at UCLA. I had not really given this very much thought, but I was challenged to think more carefully about what Jesus claimed about the world, the way he understood reality, and the claim that he made on my own life. And after thinking about it for a long time, asking a lot of questions, I finally came to the conclusion that Jesus got it right. That he saw the world the way it really was, and that the smart money, surprisingly enough to me at the time, the smart money was on Jesus. And so I began to follow him, and for the last 40 years I've been working at that, and it hasn't always been easy, I'll acknowledge that, but it's been real. And I've been trying to help other people to follow him as well. Now, I know we have a mixed audience here. A lot of people might share my convictions, some that don't, and I'm glad that you're all here. For those who don't share my convictions at this point, I just want you to know I'm not here to convert you tonight. I have a more modest goal. I want to put a stone in your shoe, okay? I just want to annoy you in a good way. Now, I know you're thinking, yeah, I expect a Christian to annoy me, so I'll fill that bill. But I want to do it in a good way. That is, I want to get you thinking about some things here. Because I'm convinced after 40 years of giving my best thinking to this, that Jesus of Nazareth and the things that he taught and the way he saw the world are worth thinking about. And this particular issue, I think, is one of the most pressing because it's hard to find any person who hasn't at some time in their life raised the complaint with regards to God and the world. Regardless of your religious convictions, why is there so much evil in the world? How could God allow such a thing if there even is a God? And I want you to consider for a moment a very powerful scene from a film that's probably 20 years old now. It's called Sophie's Choice, which included an account in the film about halfway through the film of a Polish woman who had been forced into a concentration camp during the Second World War, and her life was a mess, and you don't really know why until halfway through the movie. Sophie, played by Meryl Streep in this case, tells her love interest, Kevin Kline, what took place for her years before in a concentration camp. And here's what she says, and it's almost a monotone as she delivers it. I was arrested. My children were sent with me to Auschwitz. When the train arrived at Auschwitz, the Germans made their selection who would live and who would die. And as she reflects, there's a flashback, and she sees a soldier in front of her, and you can see this in the film, and the soldier says, you may keep one of your children, the other one must go. Do you mean I have to choose? I can't choose. You are a Pole, not a Jew. That gives you a privilege, a choice. I can't choose. I can't choose, or I'll send them both away. John, my little boy, was sent to children's camp, and my little girl, Eva, was sent to crematorium too. She was exterminated. And as the tears silently streamed down Sophie's face, she then added this, I knew that Christ had turned his face away from me, and only that a Jesus who no longer cared for me could kill those people I loved. Now, I think that Sophie's very dramatic, very moving reflection echoes our own deepest doubts about God. Again, regardless of which side of the aisle you happen to be on. This is the problem of evil, and what exactly is the problem? It can be stated quite simply. It's an objection that is meant to show that there's something contradictory about the Christian or the theist's view of the world. That if God existed and he was really good, he'd want to get rid of evil. If he was really powerful, he'd be able to get rid of evil. But evil still flourishes in our world. Therefore, God either isn't good, or he isn't powerful, or he probably doesn't exist at all. And that's why this is a favorite argument of skeptics and atheists, the most tenacious objection against theism of any kind. And I think it's a very aggressive attempt, and I understand the attempt, to defeat the Christian worldview, because the argument is that the Christian view of reality, and any theistic view for that matter, entails a contradiction, and if it's contradictory, it simply can't be true. It's a very aggressive attack, and if it succeeds, it's a fatal attack. I agree with them that any point of view that entails a contradiction has got to be false on its face. But I've just explained kind of the intellectual structure of the argument, but really this problem is beyond that, isn't it? I mean, Sophie's dilemma wasn't, as she reflected on the law of non-contradiction, she wasn't dealing with the contradictory nature of a worldview. No, for her it was personal. Only a Jesus who no longer cared for me could kill those people I loved. And when you and I face tragedy, and when things get hard and we're torn with anguish, we cry out, where was God? And in those cases, it's not intellectual, it's personal. C.S. Lewis, the greatest defender of Christianity in the 20th century, towards the end of his life, faced his deepest difficulty when he lost his wife to a sickness. Now, he said he knew too much to question God's existence. He questioned God's character. He questioned God's goodness. Bertrand Russell, the great 20th century British philosopher, atheist, asked, how can you talk about God when you're kneeling at the bed of a dying child? And if you're a theist, this kind of statement rocks you back on your heels. It's got great rhetorical force. What do you say to a challenge like that? So I want to be clear about a couple of things right from the start in dealing with this problem. I personally do not first approach this problem as a philosopher or a theologian, though I have advanced degrees in both fields. I approach it as a human being. I am just like you. I walk out of this room, I have to look at the world, I have to make sense of the world around me. I have to figure these things out. Evil touches my life as well as it touches yours, because evil is a human problem. It isn't just a religious person's problem. And this leads to the second observation I want to make. The first one is, I'm a human being, I've got to deal with. The second one, though, is I am not the only one, as a Christian theist, which is my conviction, I am not the only one that has to deal with the problem. Everybody's got to deal with the problem. Religious folks of all sorts, from different religious traditions, they have to engage this and try to make sense of evil from within their worldview. And it's not just religious folk, it's non-religious folk as well. So if you're here today as an atheist or some kind of skeptic, and you're in that position because of the problem of evil, and you have said to yourself, well, I can't believe in a God because of this difficulty in the world and all this evil in the world, I say, fine, I understand your point, but I have a question to ask you. How do you now, given the resources of the worldview that you've adopted, atheism, materialism, skepticism, whatever, how do you answer the problem of evil? Because getting God out of the equation doesn't get rid of the problem. It simply gets rid of one possible solution. And so I'm here tonight to acknowledge the reality of the problem and at the same time say that what is beholden of us as human beings living in the world trying to make sense of our world is to try to figure out which worldview option, if you will, which coherent way of viewing reality gives us the resources to make the most sense out of the problem of evil. Which worldview gives us the most traction to give the best answer? And so here's how I want to proceed. I want to begin by making 4 points. So this isn't going to be a 3-point sermon. You know this already. I'm going to begin with 4 points in a moment, and I've already given 2 points. So there's a little complexity here. So you're going to need to be more than just a warm body with your eyes open to follow what's going on. But I'm going to hold your hand. I'm going to move through this as carefully as possible. I'll try to throw the ball so you can catch it. But there is some very important things we're going to cover here. I'm going to make 4 points that will simplify the problem immensely. And in fact, they are going to surprise you what we discover, just in observing the nature of the problem itself. I want to untie this knot kind of strand by strand. And the second thing that I want to do is I want to show that the Christian view of reality, remember this is going to be a competition of worldviews, who can do the best job of answering the challenge. The Christian view of reality, properly understood, shows that there is no contradiction between the goodness and the power of God and the existence of evil. And I want to show you how God solved the problem. From inside the Christian worldview, it all makes sense. In other words, I hope to be arguing or to help you to see that the Christian worldview has a certain coherence about it that has explanatory power. And if you get outside of that and adopt some other worldview, you're going to be in trouble with making sense of your world, especially on this issue. Specifically, I'm going to argue that the answer to the problem of evil is not atheism. The answer is just the opposite. The answer to evil is God, specifically God in Jesus on a cross at Calvary. So let me start with my first of the 4 points that are meant to simplify things. You have an idea where I'm going with this. First point, evil is something No duh. I thought you were going to say something profound, Koukl, and this is like, no duh. This is why we're here, isn't it? Evil is something. Well, this is actually a profound observation. And the reason that it's profound observation is for there to be a problem of evil, there actually has to be some things that are really bad in the world. There have to be things that are wicked. There has to be evil out there, so to speak. Now, why is that an important thing to point out? That's kind of a foregone conclusion of the objection. Yes, it is, but a lot of people have not realized the implications of that. Because there are lots of people in our culture, and I suspect even on this campus, that when faced with moral judgments about things, are inclined to say something like, "Who are you to judge?" Or, "Who are you to push your morality on me? You maybe have your morality, other people have different moralities. Everybody's morality is true for them, and therefore there's no grounds to cast judgment on other people." Okay, so you know this routine. This routine has a name for it, by the way. It's called moral relativism. Moral relativism means that the truth of morality is relative to or depends upon individual people. There is no objective morality that governs everybody. There are not universal moral principles that hover over us all that become the pretext or the grounds for us to make judgments on other people. No, judgments are not allowed because morality is an individual matter. Sometimes the individual may be a group or a culture, but it doesn't go any further than that. Either individual people are responsible for morality or cultures are responsible for morality, but nobody has objective, absolute morality. That's just an invention of religion. Okay, what I've just described to you is a very popular view about morality called moral relativism. And just defining and describing it now, you are all familiar with it. Maybe you didn't know what the name was. Here's my observation. If that's your view, and you're welcome to it, I'm not going to try to disabuse you of it, you're welcome to it, you just are not welcome to the problem of evil. Because the complaint about the problem of evil requires that there is evil in the world. Not just things that happen that you don't like. Think of this for a moment. Somebody says to you, "I can't believe in God." You say, "Why not?" Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts. What's the deal with Brussels sprouts? Do you ever taste those things? They're disgusting. Now, I happen to agree with that assessment. But some people, right, do like them. Maybe even here in Kansas. Well, I can't believe in a God that would make something so disgusting to my tongue. Now, this seems to me a trivial complaint against the existence of God, and I hope you see it too. But this is what the complaint based on evil against God amounts to from a relativist. The relativist is the one who says there is no absolute objective right and wrong. It's just a matter of personal preference. It's just a matter of personal tastes. And things happen in the world that don't satisfy my own personal taste. Well, why should anybody care about satisfying your personal taste if that's all that morality amounts to? You see, in order to object to the problem of evil, there has got to be evil out there. And for evil to be out there, there has to be some kind of way, standard, scoring system of some sort that allows us to identify what's right or wrong. I don't know if there's any bowlers in the audience here. You got a cold, long, cold winter. Maybe some of you end up in the bowling alley. Californians never admit to bowling. I think they consider that lowbrow. I don't know. I go to Chicago, everybody's, I'm a bowler. They're wearing their bowling shirts, so. But how do you know a good bowler from a bad bowler? The score. Doesn't matter how you look, and doing all that stuff. If your ball goes down the gutter, you get no pins down. You're a lousy bowler, even if you look pretty, right? The scoring system, now listen carefully, the scoring system allows us to distinguish a good bowler from a bad bowler, all right? You can look a mess, and some of you probably do, going down and throwing that ball, but you knock all the balls down, you get the high scores, right? Higher the score, the better the bowler, all right? Whenever we use the term good or bad, they are always in reference to some kind of standard of scoring. If you're a relativist, you deny there is such a thing as a scoring system about morality. It's just up to the individual. Well, fine. You may even be right. But if it's just up to the individual and there is no standard of scoring, then there can be no evil in the world. There can just be things that you don't like. But other people might like them. Hitler liked to kill people, Mother Teresa liked to save them. Ultimately, what's the difference if there's no measuring standard? So my first observation is that in virtue of the fact that we have a problem to begin with, this itself becomes an argument in favor of, it's not an argument, it's evidence that morality is genuinely objective and universal in some sense. Now, maybe figuring out what those universal rules are is going to be more difficult. But if relativism is true, and that's where you want to sit, and that's the point of view that you want to advance, then fine, you're out of the discussion. And I'm not saying because I'm just disqualifying you because I don't like you. I'm saying your objection does not make sense. The objection against evil is an incoherent objection coming from a relativist. You want to be intellectually honest, you have two choices. You surrender the problem of evil as an objection, or you surrender relativism. There's no other way about it, okay? So let's say you're going to play along. Okay, today I won't be a relativist. Tomorrow I might say, don't push your morality on me. Of course, if you do that, I'm going to say, why not? And then what are you going to say? Because it's wrong? You can't say that, right? Because I don't like it, why should I care? I have no moral obligation to care about what you like on your view, right? So I think you're going to still have troubles. But in any event, I wrote a whole book on it. It's out in the back there. It's called Relativism. Feet Firmly Planted in Midair is the subtitle, and now you've got a hint to why I think that's the case. In any event, let's say you're going to bite the bullet. Okay, there is objective morality because I'm going to hang on to the problem of evil. Okay, good. I'm with you now. So because I'm with you. I think there is a real problem of evil. But see, now I've got another question. We haven't gotten into solving the problem yet, but I got another question. Remember, I said in order for there to be a real problem of evil, it's got to be objective evil. You have to have a scoring system to identify what objective evil is, and that scoring system has got to be transcendent. It's got to be above our personal opinions and our cultural opinions, or else we're stuck with relativism. All right, great. Here's my second question. Where did the scoring system come from? It's got to come from a transcendent source, which means you're not going to get this out of nature. Because biology cannot give you ethics, not those kind of ethics, not the kind of ethics you need to ground your objection against evil. Where did the scoring system come from? Now, I can't go into a lot of depth in this, and maybe we can explore a little in the Q&A, but it's going to turn out that you are not going to be able to find a source that adequately grounds objective morality except for a transcendent person whose character is the standard for everyone else. Now, that sounds a lot like God. And the answer is, you're right. Well, wait a minute. I thought the problem of evil was an argument against God. The problem of evil is one of the best arguments in favor of God. Now, I haven't answered the problem in light of God. I still have to deal with the apparent contradiction and the other things there. But I just want you to see that just by looking closely at the problem, we've eliminated relativism as an option if the problem is a real option. And it looks like we've eliminated atheism because there is no way that atheism can account for a transcendent standard of good to which we are obligated. And this is an important step. Even if there was 10 commandments written in the sky or written in a rock somewhere or whatever. Well, if it isn't a person who has the authority to command us, then there's no reason that we ought to obey them. No, the commands, moral laws that are legitimate, thank you. Moral laws that are legitimate are only legitimate because they come from a moral lawmaker that has the proper authority to make the demand and create the obligation. Now, a lot more could be said about that, and I know there's some rejoinders that I might hear during the Q&A, but I'll just give you an advance hint. Darwin is not going to rescue you here. And I'll tell you why. There's a number of reasons, but here's one reason. Darwinism is a materialistic process. And even if true, and I'm not taking that issue on right now, but even if true, all a materialistic process can do is produce a different organization of material stuff. In the beginning were the particles, and the particles moved around. And they took different shapes over time, and this is the biological world we know. But I hope you see that no recombining of molecules is actually going to make a rape wrong. No reassembling of the molecular erector set is going to cause a moral obligation to pop into the immaterial realm and present itself to us such that we have to obey it. It can't do that. It's not possible even in principle. So if I have more to say about that if you want to challenge me again, but I'm just saying this is a dead-end road. To get the kind of evil that is necessary to ground this real and significant objection, you have to have objective morality that is grounded by a person who has the authority to create obligations of us. And when those obligations are violated, that's when we complain about the problem of evil. So far, if there is no scoring system, there's no good and bad. Relativism's out. But if there is a scoring system, something's got to account for the scoring system that is a legitimate authority to do so. And it seems to me at this point, atheism is out here just as well. So, first, evil is something. It's real, and that itself allows us to make some progress on the problem. Here's the second point. Evil, I said evil is something. Now I want to say evil is not some thing. Evil is not some thing. Now I'm choosing my words carefully. It sounds like double talk, but it's not. But let me explain myself. Did you ever eat a donut hole? Now I don't mean those like round little gut bombs you eat at church sometimes. Little round things, they call them donut holes. No, that's not a donut hole. That's a donut dough. The donut hole. You know you got a donut, you got a hole. Did you ever eat a donut hole? Well, no, of course you never ate a donut hole because there's nothing to eat. Right? Because the donut hole is where the donut ain't. Okay? Now, there is a profound metaphysical observation that is entailed in this illustration. So I'm going to throw you a fancy philosopher word here that I paid a lot of money to be able to say intelligibly, but I'll explain it to you at no extra cost. Donut holes do not have ontological status, which means they ain't nothing. Wait a minute, that's a double negative. In English, you can't do that. In French, you can. When you say it ain't nothing in French, that means it really ain't nothing at all. But okay, that's what I mean. There is no existence to a donut hole. The word donut hole is a word we describe where something is missing. Same thing with shadows. Lights on, you can see your shadow. But the shadow has no ontological substance to it. It's where the light is missing. Okay, now you understand the concept here. Some of the things that we take to be real are real after a fashion, but it doesn't mean that they're made of stuff. So you take away the light, and there's the shadow. You take away the donut, and there's the hole. Evil is not something. Evil is like the donut hole. Evil is like the shadow. Evil is where goodness ain't. It's a privation. If everything is good and then something diminishes the goodness, this is what we call evil. Now, let me tell you why this observation is important. And it's not one I made. This goes back to Augustine and Aquinas and a whole bunch of really smart guys that have been dead for a really long time. But it's a great observation because, look, if evil is a thing and God created everything, then guess what? God what? Created evil. Well, that's a problem. Well, maybe evil isn't a thing. And you think about the way we talk about evil things. We talk about unrighteousness, right? We talk about impurity. The biblical word for sin, hamartia in Greek, actually means to miss the target. So even in our language, describing things that we call evil, we can see that evil is a parasite on the good. It is not something, it is a condition when something is missing. All right, now I just want you to hold that thought because we're going to come back to it in a few moments. Here's the third point. First one, evil is something. Second, evil is not something, so it doesn't need to be created as such. It doesn't have ontological status. Impress your friends with that. Third, evil is an intruder. Now, at this particular point, I'm going to start shifting into a Christian worldview. And the reason I'm doing that is twofold. This is a challenge, the problem of evil, against the Christian worldview. So it's entirely legitimate for me to get inside the worldview and say that we have the resources to answer the challenge. Okay? The challenge is against, at least in some measure, against the Christian view of reality described in the book that we call the Bible. Does that book help us to understand how this can be the place? The second reason I want to tell you this is because we can defend it from within our own worldview. Secondly, I want you to see that the Christian worldview has explanatory power. When God made everything, he made it exactly as his noble mind desired. Everything was set up just right. Everything was operating the way he made it to operate. He designed it in a certain way to function a certain way, and when things function that way, everything is right. And this is what the story means when it says that everything that God made was good. It was just so. Think of a beautiful quilt. My wife likes quilting, so this is the first thing that came to mind. A beautiful quilt that you make, and you might put it on display, and people are admiring it, and then somebody comes in and just tears the quilt in half. Now, all the pieces of the quilt are still there. Nothing has gone out of existence, and nothing has come into existence, but something's changed. That quilt is no longer the way it was designed to be. It no longer reflects the beauty that it originally had. It has been rent asunder, and therefore something ugly is before you. In fact, uglier still because of the beauty that was there before. And this is precisely the way our story, and I'm using the word story here to describe the narrative of Christianity, the narrative of reality. And when I say story here, I'm not starting in once upon a time. That's not the kind of story I'm talking about. I'm talking about the story of reality. I'm just using this language. You follow the narrative, though, and we see this, that everything is just so, and then there's a renting. And what is the renting of reality that happened? It's when human beings that were created to be in a friendship with their sovereign God abused the liberty that was given to them and rebelled against him. And when they rebelled against him, this broke something in the world. And when I say in the world, I mean in the world in the largest sense. We see the impact on man himself. We see the impact on his relationships with other human beings. We see the impact that it had on the environment. We see the impact it had on his relationship with God. This was not good. This was an evil now that is there, because something that was just the way it was supposed to be was now torn. And the reason that it was torn and broken is because of what human beings did not what God did. Evil is simply a description of a moral wound, an ethical injury that was self-inflicted when God rebelled against the appropriate leadership. When man rebelled against the appropriate leadership that was over him. Now, we have older, that's not the right way to put it. I was saying older folk here, and here I stand, gray hair, bald spot, the whole thing. So what I mean to say is, many of you are parents with children, and you know from experience that what your parents told you when you were younger, and some of you college students, your parents are still telling you and you're trying to figure this out, but you'll figure it out eventually, I promise, that parents know more than kids. Now, you're not going to get that from TV nowadays because the smartest kids and smartest people on TV are always the kids. The stupidest ones are the dads, but this is a topsy-turvy for reality. Remember, that's Hollywood, that's not reality. And parents with children, even though your children don't understand it, when you set things in order in a certain way because you know what's best for the kids, and the kids say no, and off they go, that something destructive happens to their life that they do not see coming, but you do because you've been there. It's the same kind of situation here. Man said, I'm going to do it my own. I'm following my own thing. I'm on my own. Destruction, brokenness, despair, pain. We live in a broken world, a world that man broke, human beings, and a broken world produces broken circumstances and hurts people. That's where this all came from. Sin is the word that we find in the story that describes this rebellion. It's a mutation that has twisted and distorted man from his original beauty, just like the rent in that beautiful, what do they call that thing? Quilt. It's a hard word for me at 64. Quilt. Better write that in my notes. Now, did God know this was going to happen? Yeah, he knew it was going to happen. Apparently, he felt it was worth the risk. But I want you to see that evil is an intruder. It wasn't part of the plan. And one other thing is that something good, this is the fourth thing, something good made evil possible. And what was that good thing? Moral freedom. Now remember the equation early on. If God were good, he'd want to get rid of evil. If he were powerful enough, he would be able to get rid of evil, but evil exists, and so that sounds like a contradiction. And what I want you to see is that God created human beings as something very different from any other in the creation, that they had moral freedom that allowed them to be in a special kind of relationship with their Creator. Now, what is moral freedom? I'll tell you what moral freedom is. It's a good thing that also entails the possibility of people using it for a bad thing. It is a good thing that also entails with it the possibility of being used for a bad thing. And some people think, well, why couldn't God just give human beings moral freedom and then they could have never fallen? They could have moral freedom, but he wouldn't allow them to do anything evil. And that's a contradiction in terms. Now, forgive me for a moment. I needed to get my prop. You see that? Neither can I. This is a paper clip. About 6 years ago, I was in the Ukraine teaching at a school there, a Christian school, Christian students for 2 weeks in Donetsk. And I was teaching on this material, and I got to this particular point in the conversation. I was trying to make the point that you can't have moral freedom and not have the possibility of something going wrong. And there was a young man that was in the class. His name was Vitaly, which I always had a hard time saying. I couldn't get it off my tongue quickly enough. Vitaly. So I just call him Vito, because he looked like a big guy like a Chicago punk or something like that. Like Vito, gangster type. So that was my nickname for him. Now I was working with an interpreter here, but I asked Vito to come up to the front of the classroom. Hey, Vito, come here. You're a strong guy. See this paper clip here, Vito? Da. Can you bend that into a square? Oh, da. Then he takes the paper clip and he bends it into a square. And take him a moment. There, you know, and you can kind of do that like, okay, good, Vito. Now can you bend that into a circle? Ah, da. And then he works at the paper clip a little bit. Now, you know it's already got some bends in it, so it's going to be a bumpy circle, but I was giving him a lot of grace here. And okay, there's your bumpy circle. I'll accept that. Great. Okay, one more task, Vito. I want you now to take that paper clip and I want you to bend it into a square circle. Yet. What do you mean, yet? You're a big, strong guy. You can't take that little bitty piece of wire and get your big muscles going and bend that into a square circle. Now, of course, you see the problem. Strength has nothing to do with this task. No matter how strong you are, you cannot apply strength to a little piece of wire and make a square circle because the notion of a square circle is incoherent. It's a contradiction in terms. And this is precisely what we're facing when you have human creatures that have moral freedom. Because God did something good in giving humans moral freedom because it makes them the kind of creature that could be in a special friendship with him, and they are unique in that regard. But at the same time, no amount of power, even an infinite amount of power, is going to make it possible for God to create a morally free creature for whom it is impossible to do something wrong. That's like a square circle. Now, if you realize that, you will see that on the Christian understanding of God's role in the world and the issue of evil, there is no contradiction. The Christian worldview is able to escape the contradiction because God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing evil, at least for a season, in the world, and that morally sufficient reason is because human beings are given moral freedom. It's classically called the freedom defense, or the moral freedom defense. And it is completely adequate to sidestep the charge of contradiction in the Christian worldview. I don't know how other theists are going to deal with it, but certainly within the Christian view of theism, we've avoided that problem. And I'll just tell you an insight. Professional philosophers do not raise this problem anymore, not the deductive problem of evil, because on the deductive problem of evil, the one we've been talking about, it turns out that there is no necessary contradiction, and if there's no necessary contradiction, then the defeater does not go through. It's been sidestepped, it's been parried. Now, what I've been arguing is that first evil is everybody's problem. And that my goal is to try to find a way of understanding reality that does the best job of dealing with the difficulty. Second, I said that the Christian theist has four things to say about the problem that help clarify it. First, that evil is something, but it's not secondly, something. It's real, so that relativism and atheism seem to be sidelined, but it's not something that God had to create. It came as a result of human freedom, which is the third thing, and that freedom is a good thing that God has done on our behalf. So in the Christian view, there's no contradiction between goodness and the power of God and the presence of evil, but I think we can do better than that. I think we do better than just sidestep the contradiction. Since everybody has to deal with the problem of evil, the real question is which worldview offers the best solution. I want to go back to Bertrand Russell, the 20th century British atheist who said, "How can you talk about God when you're kneeling at the bed of a dying child?" Remember I said that? And I know some of you are thinking, if you're followers of Christ, you're thinking, I hope nobody ever says that to me in a conversation about this, because I don't know what I'd say, and I didn't know what I would say until I heard Christian philosopher William Lane Craig's response to Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell's dead, but to the idea, to the challenge. And here's what William Lane Craig said. What is the atheist Bertrand Russell going to say when he's kneeling at the bed of a dying child? Tough luck? That's the way it goes? Too bad? Because that's all he's got. He cannot speak of anything redemptive. He can't talk of the patience and mercy of God. He can't mention future perfection that awaits those who put their trust in him. Cannot offer comfort. Bertrand Russell cannot even call that circumstance a tragedy if you're using the term tragedy in any morally significant way. Because as an atheist, he has no standard for good and bad. All he can do is emote. All he can do is feel bad. Because his worldview denies him anything but a tormented silence. By contrast, Christians have a lot to say. And so I want to offer 4 things right now, again, from within inside the Christian worldview of what God is doing about the problem of evil. Because he's not idle. He's not sitting on the sidelines weeping with us. As one writer, Rabbi Kushner, why bad things happen to good people. In his view, God is just not strong enough to do anything about it. He can't intervene. He weeps with us. I don't think that's an adequate answer. And that isn't the answer that the story gives us. Here are the 4 things that God is doing in response to evil. First, he has given us institutions, given our fallen circumstance. He has given us 3 institutions that are meant to restrain or mitigate the impact of evil on the world. He's organized things in a certain way to help us out in a temporary fashion. Okay, what are those 3 institutions? The family, government, and the church. And God has a very particular purpose in mind for each of those, the family, the government, and the church. And I'm not going to get into a long harangue about this, but I'm just pointing out that whenever those purposes are somehow sidelined or nullified, there is greater evil in the world. When the government does not pursue its primary function of the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right, there's trouble in the world. When the family does not operate the way that God intended, a man and a woman together for life, in honor and respect of each other, raising their children in the love and the fear of the Lord, then there is trouble in River City. When the church is pulled off of its main mission, I could say a lot about that, of doing the things that God has uniquely committed the church to do, there is more evil in the world. It's just that simple. So if we are concerned about evil in the world, maybe it would be a good idea for us to start doing things the way God intended so that there'd be less of it. Now, of course, the problem with that is we're in the same place as those first 2 people who turn their nose up at God and walk their own way. We want to do things our way, not God's way. Okay, if you want to do it your way, not God's way, then you got to live with the problems. And it's amazing how people will live in rebellion to God all their lives and sow to the wind and reap of the whirlwind and then wonder where's God when they make a mess of things. When he's given a blueprint, that might have helped. And I know some of you are thinking, yeah, but religion has caused more bloodshed than anything else in the world. And my response to that is just false. That is quantifiably false. That is, if you just simply count the bodies, it's false. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in the history of the world. And in the 20th century, conservatively, 100 million people died at the hands of 3 individuals, and Hitler was not one of them. They died at the hands of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. And they all had in common an ideology that left God out of the equation. explicitly. They tried to destroy religion. They were atheists. Now, I'm not saying every atheist has to go that way. I'm not saying that at all. There are lots of atheists that act in what one would consider a very moral fashion. What I'm saying is there is no principle of atheism that disallows that. Because atheism per se has no moral principles to it. Atheists can adopt moral principles. There's nothing inherent to atheism that puts a stop to that kind of thing. No, it's molecules clashing in the universe. There is nobody to answer to. You can be good for goodness sake if you want to or not. And Stalin and Lenin and Mao said, or not. Mao himself was responsible for 60 million dead. Now, religious evil doesn't even come close to secular evil. And I can't speak for other religions, but I'll say characteristically with Christianity, the world is literate because of Christianity. I don't know if you knew this. The world is literate principally because missionaries went to places where there were no written languages, made a written language, taught the people to write and to read so they could read the scripture. Now, some of you might take exception with their motivations. That doesn't matter to me. Maybe you don't like them going out and trying to change other people's religious views. Well, if that's your value, then maybe you shouldn't try to change ours. And part of our religious view is changing other people's religious views. So you're kind of pressed into silence on this one, it seems to me. This is a missionary religion, but I want you to see the impact of it. It isn't like we decimated all these places. We made them better places. On balance. You find the exceptions, of course, in everything. But on balance, hospitals were built, universities were founded. Every single university in the first 100 universities, including all of the Ivy League schools in this country, were founded with spiritual, religious intent. Hospitals are built, slavery is abolished, education flourishes, the poor and homeless are clothed and fed, families and societies are strengthened when the church does what the church is supposed to do. Now, if you disobey Jesus, and you go out in the name of Jesus, and you make a mess of things, Jesus himself has a word for you. And here's what he says: "Depart from me, you who work iniquity, I never knew you." So you can hardly, I think, with intellectual credibility, hold Jesus and Christianity responsible for the crimes of its heretics. That is, the crimes of those people who do not live the way Jesus taught them to live. So God has first given institutions of family and church and government to restrain the impact of evil in the world. Here's the second thing he's done. Remember I said he's done 4 things. So here's our answer to the problem. We've sidestepped the contradiction. Here's our answer to the problem. Number 2, God will give his Spirit to any person who asks to help them overcome the power of evil in their lives. Now, this puts a new angle on things because we characteristically complain about the problem of evil out there as if somebody else is at fault. Guess what? We're the ones who are at fault for a lot of it. We perpetrate evil in our own individual lives, and the people that we are interacting with, the relationships that we have. Oh, I know what you're thinking. Oh, I'm no Hitler. I'm no Hitler. Good. You know Jesus Christ either. And Hitler's not the standard. Jesus is the standard. And if you are willing to be truthful with yourself, you would realize that you're as much of the problem, a part of the problem, as anybody else that you complain about. So you want to deal with the problem of evil? You start right at home. You start with yourself. Well, that's hard to do. I know it's hard to do. It's worse than hard. It's impossible. You need help. You need God's help. And God says, I'm there. I will help you. I will work. You ask me, I'll help you. So here's the second thing that God has done. He's provided his Spirit. Third, there will come a time when God will remove every remnant of evil from the earth. God is going to clean up. People are concerned about evil. Why didn't God come and do something? Our story's not over yet. But one thing I want you to realize, that when God comes to deal with evil, he is going to do a complete job. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, when the playwright walks on the stage, the play is over. And I want you to think for a moment, if God were to come tonight at midnight to deal with all the evil in the world, where would you be at 12:01? You see, our hands, once again, are on the smoking gun. There is a future. There is a time when God will wipe every tear away and set up an environment in which goodness reigns perfectly and completely. But that time is not yet. Something else is happening, and this is the fourth thing that God is doing about evil. In the meantime. And here's the fourth thing. God has sent his Son to die for evil men and women so that he could offer mercy instead of justice, so that we can be forgiven rather than be condemned. In other words, God is now delaying because he's patiently waiting. If it wouldn't look too good for you at 12:01 if God came to deal with things right now, then maybe you're the reason God is waiting to bring that perfect environment in. Because he wants to give you mercy instead of justice. Like the woman who hired the photographer, she looked at the photograph, she said, "Photographer, this picture doesn't do me justice." And he said, "Honey, you don't need justice, you need mercy." And the story tells us, in the last days scoffers will come saying, "Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep," all continues, just as it was from the beginning of creation. Jesus said he was coming back. I don't see him. He hasn't come back for 2,000 years. He's never coming back. And the author of this, disciple of Jesus himself, Peter, says that the Lord is not slow, as some count slowness, but rather he is long-suffering. He is patiently waiting, not willing that any would perish, but all would come to a point of changing their minds and turning to him and receiving the forgiveness he offers, the mercy that he provides, rather than the justice that is due us. What is God doing about evil? He's given us institutions to mitigate the impact. He will give us his Spirit to help us deal with evil in our life. He will one day return and take care of all the evil and set up the perfect kind of world that our hearts all yearn for. But in the meantime, he has sent his Son to die for evil people, and that would be you and me. Now, I think a couple of things here are clearer. First, if there is no God, we pretty much have to give up the idea that there is any evil at all. And this complaint that seems so legitimate just evaporates in thin air. And this is why I think it's better, makes more sense to go with the God option than without. Because if there is no God, then nothing is ultimately bad or deplorable or tragic or worthy of blame. And also, there's nothing ultimately good. Nothing honorable, nothing noble, nothing worthy of praise. It's all lost in a twilight of moral nothingness if God is out of the picture. It's just stuff. It's just molecules clashing in the universe. And I think we also realize that most people would not fare well if God dealt with evil today, because we would be under judgment. I think what we really want is we'd want a God who took evil seriously. We'd want a God to provide a way to protect us from evil without taking away all of our moral choices. We'd want a God who would give us an opportunity for mercy instead of simply judging us, and we'd want a God who had a plan for completely transforming this world so that in the end things would be restored to ultimate goodness. Well, friends, that's exactly what God has done. Atheism's not the answer to this. God is the answer. In Jesus, on a cross, taking punishment for our crimes so that mercy can then be extended to us. And it's not just simply that God is a good solution, or even that he's the best solution. It seems to me he's the only solution that's going to ultimately solve the problem. One last thing before we take your questions. I want you to remember that God is not a stranger to suffering. And this probably is one of the most sublime aspects of the Christian understanding of reality. Because in our view, God is not out there somewhere detached, looking down with an angry scowl, ready to pummel us for the things that we've done wrong, and even if we do deserve it. But rather, God initiated a rescue plan by taking on a human form himself, actually becoming human, adding humanity to his divinity. Some people think the greatest verse of the Bible is the very first line of our story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I'd say that's pretty cool. I mean, if God can do that, that's worthy of a nod. But I actually think that's the second greatest passage in the story. The first one is in the New Testament. And it goes like this: and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. You see, God was not satisfied just to stay out there. He came down and he lived among us, and he took on a human form to experience what we experience, to be a servant for us. You want to talk about the innocent suffering, you think about Jesus. Jesus was supremely innocent. He never did anything wrong. In fact, that was the point. He lived the life that we were supposed to have lived before the Father. The life we did not live, he lived in our behalf, so that he could give that life to us and take to himself the punishment that we deserved. He took it on himself. And he, being supremely innocent, took the punishment that each of us collectively deserved before the Father. We put him on the cross. Actually, an appropriate thought this close to Easter. If you're angry about evil, don't blame God. Blame rebellion against God, of which we are party. Ultimately, our individual response to the problem of evil will be the same one as the thieves that were crucified with Jesus of Nazareth at Golgotha, place of the skull, 2,000 years ago. We will either shake our fist at God and say he's not fair, or we will humbly ask forgiveness instead of criticizing God for not doing enough. Which thief will you be like? Which thief will you be like? Well, at least it's something to think about. Thank you very much. We're going to get set up now for the Q&A, and as you're thinking about what question that you'd like to ask me, My request is you can ask a question or make a comment. It's fine with me. If you make a comment, I might respond to it. I just care that you are short, okay? This is not that you be brief. Not that you're short, but that you're brief. Sorry. Tall people have a place. We believe in that kind of diversity. But this is actually not a place for extended debate. I might ask some questions of you if you challenge me to kind of get clear on a few things, but I'll do my best to answer whatever you have, and then we'll get moving. I want to say something as you're getting ready, and we'll have a full hour, and I'll bounce back and forth between the mics. I want to say something about this card that was handed out to you. I represent an organization called Stand to Reason, and our goal is to train Christians to think more carefully about their convictions and be able to make a thoughtful and gracious and attractive but effective defense for classical Christianity and classical Christian values. And so if you're a follower of Christ, I want to mentor you at a distance. If you're not a follower of Christ, I want to annoy you at a distance. In either case, I'll tell you how you can do that. One is to go to our website. The organization is Stand to Reason. The acronym is STR. The URL is str.org. Really easy. We got more than 2,000 pages of content on our website dealing with all kinds of things you can imagine that relate to thoughtful Christianity and the challenges on it. You can also catch my radio show there. One of the best things I think you can do to grow in these kinds of things and understand them is just listen over my shoulder for 3 hours a week. That's all the podcast is, 3 hours running. And I take open calls. You can call me if you want. Doesn't cost anything. And 3 hours is not burdensome. It's just one LA commute. So I invite you to sign up for that. You can follow me on Twitter if you like. You can like me on Facebook. I always think that sounds a little weird. Would you please like me on Facebook? Well, I don't like you anyplace else. Why should I like you there? But here's what this card is for. If you fill this card out, bend it in the middle, by the way, and tear off the blue part. That's a little thumbnail sketch of how to use questions to engage in conversation in a productive way. It's self-explanatory. The white thing is for me. If you fill this out and tell me where you live, I will send you free training material every single month. One thing that comes out bi-monthly is our Solid Ground newsletter. Many of you have an example of that. And the one that I just finished writing a couple days ago that's coming out May 1st has to do with why evolution, in detail, why evolution cannot deal with the moral argument for the existence of God. Evolution is no way out here. Even in principle, it's not possible to solve that problem. In fact, evolution renders the statement goodness for goodness sake meaningless. In any event, if you want to read that kind of thing, this is what we'll send you. You're not going to find in our newsletter pictures of our staff at bake sales, so it's not that kind of thing. But we need to know where you live. If you take a moment and fill this out, and if you don't have one of these, but would like one, do we have some people with extras here somewhere? Can you? Yeah, in the back. If you would raise your hand, then we'll have somebody, if you don't have one of these cards, you can raise your hand and somebody in the back will find you and give you one. Here's a hand right here. There's a couple others going up. See, once the first hand went up, the others got braver. All right, I'm one of those. So just keep your hand up for a moment, and the gals will get you a card. The third thing I want you to consider, and when you put your name and address, put your email address on it too, because we can send you all of this stuff virtual. And it's better that way because it's cheaper for us, and then you could just push a button and send it to somebody else if you want to do that. If you like the article, then you could send it to others. So fill that out, and when you go out then, there's a table just on your way out. Drop the card off at the table, and you might want to think about grabbing some things there. For example, this book here, Tactics, a Game Plan for Discussing Your Christian Convictions, this will change, if you're a follower of Christ, this will change the way you engage people. It will be a game changer for you, I guarantee you, I promise you. And I can promise you confidently because there's been so many people who have told me that's been the case for them. You'll also see a little red booklet here. This is like easy reading, right? For the reading challenge. It's also for the financially challenged. $2. But the title says Jesus the Only Way, 100 verses. What I want Christians and others to be clear on with regards to the notion of Jesus being the only way of salvation is that we didn't make this up. Jesus said it. and so did everyone that he trained to follow after him, personally trained. And so I put together 100 verses that indicate that, either explicitly or implicitly, 9 lines of argument. The last thing I want to recommend is called Cold Case Christianity. This was written by a colleague of mine, J. Warner Wallace. He works for our organization. He's a speaker for us. He was a cold case cop for almost 30 years. He solved some of the toughest cases in Los Angeles, and you might have seen him on the cop show where they redo the whole, he's done 5 of those programs because he's solved these crimes. Anyway, he took his detective skills and he applied them to the case for the New Testament and the documents pertaining to Christ and the historicity of the life of Christ, and came up with this fabulous book, Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. And I've never read anything as good or as interesting as this on the topic. So I want to commend that to you. And if we run out, you can go to our website at str.org or go to Amazon and get them as well. But we have some copies out there. Okay, having said that, we have one questioner. Okay, well, you want to come up to the microphone so that we can hear what you have to say. We want to get you on record. There's room here. All right. Okay, ma'am, you're first.
I'm short, so hopefully that will.
You're short, okay. So you qualified.
I'll try to be brief too. Thank you for coming to Canada.
You're welcome.
I hope you like your visit here. Okay.
So far.
Recently I've been struggling with a question. My husband and I recently had a loss, and it's brought up a lot of questions for me. Okay, trying to be brief. I understand that evil exists, and that's because humans chose to sin, and not something that God did. And I want to tell you about a woman that I know, and then ask you a question. This woman that I know has suffered in her life. She's a strong Christian. She follows God, she trusts Him, she praises Him, she doesn't doubt Him, despite the fact that she's been through abuse, poverty, bullying. She had a car accident that killed her daughter about 10 years ago. She has had 4 miscarriages. She's had chronic pain from the car accident. She's been separated from her husband, who's a schizophrenic, for 12 years. At a couple different times he's tried to kill her, that sort of thing. So she's been through just a ton of pain. And then I know other people whose biggest struggle in life is coming up with the money for their kitchen remodel, or something like that. So, and it's not that, I've asked this question before, and people have said, well, you just don't know the kitchen remodel person well enough, or they just haven't lived long enough to experience all this pain.
Yeah.
But,
So your question?
the question is, why does she suffer because of humankind's mistakes and sins? That's the first part. And the second part is, why do some people seem to suffer more than others? And the only thing that I can think of with her is that because she's so faithful to God, God allows her to go through all of these things.
Okay.
And be a testimony.
That could be, but I have a very simple answer for this. It's very easy. Why do people in those circumstances sometimes suffer and others don't? Okay, you ready? You want to write this down? I don't know. And nobody else does here either. And I don't mean to be flippant because I know it's a serious question, but I wanted that to sink in. When it comes to questions about individual experience, why did my son have to die in Iraq? Why did my children, why did my parents, why did this happen to me? The answer regarding that individual's life, it's not answerable. And the reason it's not answerable is because these are things in the minds of God that He has not chosen to reveal. But I will offer something a little broader. And this is something that is not talked about enough with Christians or in Christian circles. There is what I think a kind of inappropriate triumphalism in Christianity, where we act like everything's always wonderful. But if you have any exposure to Christian biography, that is people who were used significantly by God, and you see what took place in their lives, you realize that Christians, just like non-Christians, have to live with the contingencies of being in a fallen world. There is no promise by God for protection of Christians from just about anything in the world that non-Christians might experience. And in fact, sometimes it seems that the non-Christians get off scot-free and the believers are going through hell. And what's up with that? Well, I'll tell you what's up with that. It's exactly what the New Testament says is going to take place. In this world you have tribulation, Jesus said. Now he added, be of this good cheer, I have overcome the world. But overcoming the world does not mean that he's going to protect every Christian from cancer and rape and hardship and kids going on drugs and divorce and all. Those things all happen to Christians. The difference for the Christian and the non-Christian is the Christian has a promise from God. And I'm going to give you the entire promise because I've almost never heard it recited completely, though some of you are familiar with a portion of it. It comes from the book of Romans chapter 8. And here's what Paul says. He said, we know, that's how he starts, we know that God causes, so God's an active agent here. He's not sitting on the sidelines. We know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Now, I'm not done yet because there's more, but I just want you to see that. He is not saying, as some people mistakenly misquote this passage, well, everything works out for good in the long run. Baloney. It does not work out for good for everybody in the long run. This is not a promise that God is making to humanity. Much of humanity sows to the wind. They reap the whirlwind. That's in the Hebrew prophets, by the way. That's where that phrase came from. And they suffer from their own mistakes, and they do not get rescued. No, I'm not saying God's not willing to rescue. They don't call out for rescue much of the time. Or they're not interested in living the way God wants them to live. They just want God as a Santa Claus to rescue them from their hardship in the moment. Maybe that's not the best way to describe it. But as they're foxhole Christians or theists, and then when they get out of the foxhole, then they're done with God and they move on to something else. If we want God's help, we have to take the world on God's terms. And this is kind of the way it works. But for the Christian, we know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, believers, he predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. So what this means then is not that, gee, if you lose one job, God's going to give you a better job down the line, Romans 8:28-29. If your girlfriend leaves you, he's going to give you a prettier girl down the line, or something like that. No, God doesn't close the door, but he opens a window. No. What it means is whatever it is that you go through, God himself will redeem that hardship for the most important thing that can happen in your life, and that is that you be internally transformed to be more like Christ. That's what God cares about more than anything else. So the way you ended your question, like maybe it's because this woman God is doing something in her life well, I think you can bank on that, certainly. If she's following Christ, for those who follow Christ, there is nothing that he allows to come into your life that he has not allowed to come into your life for some purpose. He will not withhold any good thing from you. I had a teacher when I was very first Christian. I'm so thankful for this teaching because it helped me a lot in my own life, because my life in 40 years as a Christian has not been easy. Here's what he said. He said, Jesus is not the bridge over troubled waters. Now, this is during the Jesus movement where there was lots of triumphalism, and Simon and Garfunkel were really popular. Now, in my view, they still should be popular, but that's another issue. He said, Jesus is not the bridge over troubled waters, but he will pull you through the troubled waters if you can stand the tow. All who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. That's Paul to Timothy. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul, after just describing, I'll just close with this. I know you're thinking, I did not expect a whole sermon on this, so. Paul just describing in chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians his own trials and tribulations in life that came as a result of being faithful to the gospel and the calling. He says, but momentary light affliction, what you just described, then later on in the book, is being beaten and being with rods and stoned in Lystra, and 3 days and 3 nights in the deep, and in trouble with the Jews and in trouble with the Romans, and running for his life hither, thither, and yon. And he says, momentary light affliction. It didn't sound like anything like momentary light affliction, but Paul is putting it in perspective. He says, momentary light affliction is producing. It is producing. It is the affliction that's producing an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison. As we look at the things not which are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are perishing, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Now that's 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse, I think, 16 through 18. And more followers of Christ ought to read that. And if you're still bummed out, then just read 1 Peter, the whole book. Because 1 Peter was made for Christians going through adversity, because that's a standard way of life for followers of Christ. But it's not for naught. God will use it. And that's the best answer I can give.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Ty?
Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
It's hard. I'm having a hard time hearing because I have these hearing aids that are stuck in my ears and they're getting in the way of the sound. So, hi.
One thing I had a question about is that you said that evil and suffering in the world that humans experience
Yes.
is a result of the original sin,
Yeah.
and the fall. And it seems to me that there are a lot of sources of suffering in the world, from natural sources, viruses, plagues, natural disasters, hurricanes. And it seems to me that it would be odd to say that these things originated with the fall, because it seems to me like the geological record indicates, and record we have fossils, viruses would indicate that these things have been around longer than humans have.
Yeah. Right. I agree with you on that. I am not convinced that things like floods and earthquakes and what we might call natural disasters are results of the fall and evil in themselves, because these seem to be part of the natural functioning of the earth. I mean, we have plate tectonics that allows the earth to recycle itself, and plate tectonics cause earthquakes, and earthquakes cause tsunamis. The problem is when human beings get in the way of those things, because if these things happen with no human beings around, then we wouldn't take note of it. We wouldn't say, gee, there was a moonquake, for example, and a couple of mountains on the dark side of the moon fell over. We would kind of ponder the problem of evil in that. It's only when people get in the way of those things. So I don't have a thorough answer for that. Partly because I'm not convinced that the so-called natural evils are a result of the fall. They seem to be natural things that happen that are part of the design features of the planet that people end up getting in the way of. I'll just offer some thoughts for you to think about. Though I think some of those features are characteristic of the way God made the world, we cannot deny that there are, at least according to the way the story is told, there is an impact on the world as a result of the fall. And this is why you see a cursing of the soil and the thorns and the thistles and stuff. And this suggests that part of the impact of the fall was on the environment. I can't tell you what that really amounted to, because it doesn't give any detail. It says in the book of Romans that the earth groans itself waiting for its redemption. So I think there was an impact of some sort. But I don't think the impact was that all of a sudden earthquakes started, because I think there's a different source there. The second thought about this is that notice that these becomes evil when people get in the way. And why is it that people get in the way? Because they exercise free choices to live places where things could happen that could hurt them. So you're not going to, if you're living in Kansas, you don't have to worry about tsunamis, right? But if you live on the coast, if you choose to live on the coast, then that's going to be a problem. Now, maybe you have tornadoes or something, and we don't have those in the West Coast, but we've got earthquakes. We just had one a couple days ago. So some, and I'm not saying all of it, but some of this is still related to human freedom. that because humans can make free choices, they freely choose to be in places in which they get in the way of some of these natural events that are problematic. But I have to do more thinking on that. I'm only partially satisfied. I don't think that's a full answer. And some other people have worked this out better than I have, but I think that those are some things worth thinking about there. Okay, thank you. Yes. Mr. San Francisco.
Yes.
Are you from San Francisco, or you just went there and bought the T-shirt?
I have a t-shirt.
Okay.
So you're saying that sin exists because we are given moral freedom. We're
Yes.
allowed to choose to sin. That's a good thing.
That's right.
Someday we will all be in heaven.
Well, not all of us, but
Well, yes.
I understand what you
Some
mean.
people will exist in heaven.
Yeah,
In heaven, there will be no sin.
correct.
How does that mesh up? Do we no longer have moral freedom once we are in heaven? Is sin possible while in heaven and just no one will pick it?
Yeah,
How does that?
sure. It's a great question. Now, different people are going to answer this in different ways, but I'll give you my own conviction about it. It appears to me that there will be no possibility to sin in heaven. It will be impossible. It'll be impossible in the same way that it is impossible for God to sin. We will be transformed and made immutably good. So in heaven, we can do whatever we want, but the only things that we will want to do are good things, okay? Now, this raises a question. I thought moral freedom entails the possibility of doing bad, and that's true, on my view at least, which means, strictly speaking, you will not have that kind of moral freedom in heaven. That is, you will not be able to do bad, so you will not have moral freedom. But keep in mind, in that sense, you would be like God. God doesn't have moral freedom in that sense. God is not capable of doing bad either. Freedom generally means, when you talk about what's called, philosophers called libertarian freedom, freedom means not just doing what you want, but at least in principle, having the possibility of doing otherwise. Could have done otherwise. It's the CDO condition. You could have done otherwise. We will not have the CDO condition available to us in heaven with regards to moral behavior. So strictly speaking, on my view, we won't have libertarian freedom in heaven. We will have something better. We will be made immutably good. Now, when Adam was given moral freedom, in Adam's case, he could have done otherwise, and he did otherwise, okay? It was possible for him not to sin, but it was also possible for him to sin. They got a fancy Latin phrase for this, posse non peccare, posse peccare. He could go either way. After the fall, it's not possible for us not to sin. We're sinners by nature. We're in rebellion by nature. This is why God has to rescue us. Once we're in heaven, it won't be possible to sin. We will be made into a position of moral perfection. Okay, well, what's the point of having moral freedom here then? And I think the answer to having moral freedom in this life is that there are certain virtues that we can develop in a condition where sin is possible that cannot be developed in a situation where sin is not possible. If we are to develop something like long-suffering or forgiveness or something like that, there are other virtues that can only be developed in the face of sin. What this means then, and this is probably going further than what you had really even thought about here, although it was a very perceptive question, and it was a lot of other Christians don't think about. This life is a place where we are slowly being transformed into something better than we were that will make a difference in heaven. Paul says physical exercise profits a little, pump and iron, but godliness is a means of great gain, for it holds a promise not only for this life, but also for the life to come. Gee, what does that mean? Well, I'm not entirely sure how that plays out. But what it does mean, at least minimally, is it matters in this life how your character is formed and your character is going to be formed principally in the midst of hardship and trial that would not be possible without living in a sinful world. So there's a kind of a package deal going here. I am looking forward to the time when I won't have to have this fight with the flesh, the Bible calls it, but that won't end until I end my earthly life. And in the meantime, I want to fight that good fight, and that will produce something good in the future. So I think this all works into the answer to your question, but there's still a lot of imponderables as well. All right? Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. Klaus Lundstedt from the philosophy department here. I'm one of these professional.
You're in the philosophy department here?
Yes.
Okay, glad to have you.
Okay, so I think that one should make this distinction between natural evil and man-made evil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I do not think that you have provided a satisfactory answer to the problem of natural evil.
Wait, I missed the last sentence.
You have not provided a satisfactory answer to the problem of natural evil.
No,
And
I don't think my answer was satisfactory either,
Yeah,
so
well, you
there's more that I could do, right?
But one comment on the problem of man-made evil, for which you offer sort of a free will defense. I find it appalling that you take Hitler off the list of the other mass murderers that you mentioned, and I find it appalling that you try to establish a connection between atheism and immoralism. Hitler has never been excommunicated from the Catholic Church throughout his entire life. He's responsible for at least 6 million dead Jews.
Right.
Plus,
And 6 million
plus
Gentiles. Right, 6 million Gentiles as well, right.
That's the comment, okay?
Okay.
Now here's the question.
Before you ask the question, can I just quickly respond to that particular point?
Short question, short answers. Right?
No,
Okay.
that's all right, but we'll just take one at a time and then I'll let you come back in. Okay, I didn't at all mean to give Hitler the short shrift. I was making the point that when people think of terrible mass murderers, they're thinking of Hitler, but I'm making the point that Hitler wasn't on the top 3, which was meant to make the top 3 more egregious, not less egregious. So I wasn't giving him the moral short shrift. If you understood it that way, please understand that that is not what I meant.
I'm just saying that there is no eternal essential connection between theism and morality or atheism and immorality.
You say there's no essential connection? I'm sorry, it's just
There's
hard.
no connection, no internal connection between atheism and immorality and theism and being
Okay,
moral.
I'll respond to
that's,
that.
That's what you were insinuating.
Right, I
Okay.
will, all right.
So, and here's my actual question. I give you that there is no logical problem, that this problem, this so-called logical problem or deductive problem, as you called it, of evil can be sort of sidestepped. I give you that. But there's still another problem left, which is called in the literature frequently at least, the evidential problem.
The inductive problem, right.
Right. And so it goes like this, right? There is evidence not only that there is evil in the world, but the most important point is that there is pointless evil in the world. There is unnecessary evil in the world.
Right.
So why in a tsunami do hundreds, thousands of people have to die? Why not only 150? Right? So there seems to be evidence that there is unnecessary or pointless evil in the world. This is one thing. If there is unnecessary, so if God is all good, all knowing, all powerful, then one would expect he wouldn't allow for unnecessary evil. But there is unnecessary evil. Therefore, we have good evidence to believe that there is no such God that is all good, all knowing, all powerful. It's not a logical contradiction. It's an argument that is based on evidences and observations that you make about the world.
Right, okay, I understand it. I'm glad you brought this up. This is another angle to the problem of evil. I mentioned the deductive problem. This is sometimes called the evidential or the inductive problem of evil. And the point of the argument is to observe that maybe evil in the world could be consistent with a good God, but not the amount of evil that we have. And the gentleman, professor, used the phrase pointless evil, and then made the claim there is pointless evil in the world, and if there is a good God, there wouldn't be any pointless evil in the world, then to connect the syllogism, therefore, this God doesn't exist. A couple of thoughts on this. First of all, one who makes the argument is still strapped with the difficulty of trying to make sense of the term evil to begin with in light of a standard that defines.
It's a perversion of good, I give you that.
Pardon me?
It's a perversion of good, of the good, of goodness, I give you that.
Well, the point that I made earlier,
Standard.
the point that I made earlier is that in order to have good and evil make sense, be meaningful terms, they have to be measured to some standard. So if we say there's gratuitous evil in the world, that is pointless evil, then we are saying that there is something that happens that should not be taking place. And so my question then is, in what sense should that not be taking place? It must be violating some objective standard of evil, and what is the grounding for that standard? So once again, even with the inductive problem, you are facing the same difficulty, that you're acknowledging the existence of objective evil in the world, and there has to be a grounding for it.
Yes, but there is objective, pointless evil in the world. I give you that. Evil is subjective, and we need some objective moral standards. I'm not a relativist, and atheists need not be relativists. I give you that. But
If you're
there's pointless, objective evil in the world.
Okay, so then you don't affirm relativism is false. There is some form of
I
objectivism.
agree with that.
Okay, so, but follow the discussion here, folks. If we are going to conclude that because there are what we say are pointless evil, and I'll get to that particular issue in just a minute, that we say there is pointless evil, therefore there is no God, which is the way the argument goes, then in what sense are we justified in calling the behavior or the actions or the conduct or the consequences evil to begin with? We are straddled with the same problem. So it seems to me that the problem only makes sense if there is a transcendent standard by which we can call some things pointless evil. We're back to the same place again. So now the question is,
I think it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that there must be a transcendent standard that tells us what's objectively good or bad. I just don't see that.
I'm sorry.
There's an inference here that I can't follow. I mean, why must there be a transcendent standard for there to be objective evil? I don't.
Well, when you say that something is bad or wrong, what are you comparing it to in order to declare it so?
Yeah,
Are you saying that you just feel that way, or
very mundane, secular
Pardon me?
answers, for instance, an action is bad if it cannot be universalized, right? Kantian answer, if it doesn't
I'm
make
not
sense.
even. I'm not.
There are several non-theological answers to this question, and so it certainly is not implied that there is a divine standard that we have to apply in order to know what objective evil is.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Kantian approach and all of that. I'm just saying I have not seen anything that comes even close to being satisfying as providing an objective standard, a way of showing that certain things are evil in themselves unless you have some kind of transcendent standard. Just because we all agree to these particular things, that doesn't make the action evil. It just means that we've agreed to call it that for our own purposes, okay? So, but the last point that I want to get to, the first one I made is, if we're going to call gratuitous evil evil, then we are still stuck with the problem of the standard, the criterion. But you mentioned, Professor, a number of times that there is pointless suffering. So I have a question for you. How do you know that the suffering to which you're referring is pointless?
And how do you know it's not pointless?
Well, I don't have to say it's not. You're the one who's making the argument that there is pointless suffering, and therefore there isn't a God, and therefore hold on, Professor.
Look around in the world. I told you, I gave you the example
Yeah,
of the tsunami and so on. Why hundreds, thousands of people? Why not just 1,000, let's say?
I wonder if we could.
550.
I wonder if I could ask a favor. Why don't I finish my thought, and then I'll give you the floor, and you can come back. Okay? You're asking me, how do I know that it's not pointless? But of course, I'm not making the argument. You're making the argument that there is pointless evil, and this then becomes evidence against God. So therefore, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that all of this evil is pointless, and I don't know how you can actually know that, and that's central to your argument. Your turn.
I could go on about this. Your modus tollens is my modus ponens, right? And we could go on about this. I think somebody else should.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. Just to finish the thought then, one has to demonstrate, and I thank you, I do thank you. Let's applaud the professor, please. If one argues that there is all kinds of pointless suffering in the universe or in the world, and therefore there is no good that's adequate to justify that from a good God, one has to give the reason why they are sure that all of the suffering is pointless. Now, this to me is a very huge burden of proof. Do I think that there are things that happen in the world that seem to be pointless suffering? Sure. I thought there was a lot of pointless suffering in my own life. And now 20 years later, I look back and I can see, wow, that wasn't for no good, but it was for some good. Now that's enough to show me that maybe I'm not the best judge of whether suffering has a point or not. And therefore, if we can't with a certainty say that there is pointless suffering in the universe, then the argument that is the inductive argument based on the problem of evil itself doesn't go through. And it is still strapped with this problem of the criterion that I mentioned earlier. Okay, that's good. Let's go to the gentleman here.
Good evening, Dr. Koukl.
Thank you for the promotion. I'm not actually a doctor, but I'm a master twice. That's good enough for me.
Well, I assumed you were because
Thank you.
because actually I listened to you on the Bible Man broadcast when you talked about tactics and
Yes.
stuff like that. But this might be a little off the subject, but might be on the subject.
Okay.
You talked about evil. A few weeks ago, I was watching Hannity, and they ran a story about a case, I think it was in Wisconsin, where I think it was the Freedom from Religion Foundation got some Bibles removed from some building on their campus that was state-sponsored, and the young lady that represented this particular organization was saying it was a triumph of the Constitution, which is a secular doctrine, all that kind of jazz. And Hannity was saying back and forth. But basically she said, I was wondering how would you answer this, you know? Well, Hannity was saying, look, the Bible's in the drawer, you have to pick it up, you know? And she said, but she doesn't want it in there at all. This group doesn't want the Bible in there at all. And basically she was saying...
I missed part of what you're saying just because it was bad acoustics.
Oh, bad acoustics. Oh, is this better?
Yeah, I'd say so. I was just treat it like an ice cream cone. Just get right on.
Hopefully nutty coconut. But what I was saying was, this person from the Freedom of Religion Foundation was saying basically about the Bible that, how would you answer this? She was basically saying it promoted evil. This Bible teaches that life is cheap, it subjugates women and promotes slavery, stuff like that.
Okay.
How
would I respond to that?
I have a pretty good answer for the last one myself, but...
Yeah. The question is, this Bible subjugates women, cheapens life, promotes slavery. I've heard this kind of challenge before, and whenever you want to take exception with, say, someone's point of view, one of the most important things that you can do is get a clear understanding of what the other person's point of view is before you start taking exception with it, okay? And if you misunderstand the other person's argument and then defeat a distortion of it, this is called a straw man fallacy, and it's bad manners and it's bad thinking. This happens a lot of times by accident or unwittingly when people go to the scripture and they read an ancient Hebrew document with 21st century eyes. For example, the Bible cheapens human life. Now, I'm not exactly sure to what she was referring. I know that she talked about subjugation of women and slavery. What she doesn't realize, and if somebody wants more detail on virtually all of these questions, they can go to the book, Is God a Moral Monster? By Paul Copan, C-O-P-A-N. He's a philosopher, and he's done a good job doing the historical work. The Hebrew word for slave, that is translated English slave, I think is the word Eber, E-B-E-R, okay? The word Eber does not mean slave. It means servant. And up until the beginning of the 20th century was almost consistently translated in English translations as servant. Something happened after the beginning of the 20th century where translations more and more translated the word servant into the word slave. And what happens is American readers conjure up pictures of the slavery that they are used to historically, and they think that that's what's being talked about in the text. The slaves, the ebers, the servants, and these would be indentured servants of the Old Testament time, they actually had representation. They had union representation. And what was that? It was the Mosaic Law, which laid out very, very specific protections for those that would indenture themselves to the Jews for a period of time in order to help them out financially. And some of these people had no other choice but to do that. And so instead of cheapening life like that, the law actually ennobled those people in a way that nobody else in the ancient Near Eastern culture was willing to do. They elevated them. And the same thing was true about women. If you see what the New Testament teaches about women in light of the practices of the time, when Paul says there is neither slave nor free in the church, there is neither Jew nor Gentile in the church, there is neither male nor female, we are all equal under the cross. He was saying something radically countercultural at the time. The unfortunate thing is people who are not students of the history and the text and the background and the languages just jump into it with their own preconceptions, and they read things into it that aren't there and then draw the wrong conclusions. The fact is that the New Testament documents were like the Magna Carta for people by comparison to the way they lived there. Are there role distinctions in families? Yes, that's taught in the New Testament, I think. Are there role distinctions in the church? Yes, I think that's taught too. That is different from having value distinctions. And role distinctions have their place for creating order and maintaining safety for everyone involved. So I think that a lot of people just simply unwittingly misread because they don't take into account the teaching that's given in light of the culture that we find these texts in. These are wildly liberating countercultural texts in the context of those cultures. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hey, Greg. We're about 6 minutes away, so I think
Okay.
we have 2 more questions and we'll be done.
All right, we'll have one here and then the lady here, and that'll be it. Okay, thank you.
My question was, you didn't mention in your how evil came about in the world. You didn't go back beyond the fall of man and Adam and Eve. It appears to me that evil originated before the earth was created, or at some point.
Yes.
When Lucifer rebelled against
Correct.
God.
Yeah. I didn't say that because, though I think that's true, it's probably the case that that Luther rebelled against God. Lucifer, not Luther. He's another guy. That Lucifer, I have never done that before. That Lucifer, now see if this was a Catholic group, that would really be a good joke, you know. There is very little information in the text about this individual that used to be Lucifer, who is now the devil. Lucifer, Hillel, the angel of light, as it were, was responsible for a rebellion in heaven. And we get some detail maybe in some of the prophets, and we get some detail in the book of Revelation, but we don't have a lot of information. I spoke principally of the human condition, because the source of evil in the human condition is not Satan. It's man's rebellion against God. And the story is told the way it is. The narrative is told the way it is, not to give us exhaustive information about everything that happened, but to tell us in narrative form what the important details of history are that relate to the big issue. That is the problem and the solution and the final restoration. Every worldview has 4 pieces to it. Creation, what is the nature of ultimate reality? How did it all begin? Fall, what's the problem? Redemption, how do you fix the problem? And restoration, how you put the fix into play and bring things back to normal. And those details are captured, particularly the fall part, with regards to man's rebellion. Though he was tempted, the rebellion was still upon his shoulders. So the responsibility for man's fallen condition is on the shoulders of man, not on the shoulders of the devil. Okay? And our last question, we started with a lady, we'll end with a lady.
Hi. I have kind of thought that a lot of the confusion this evening seems to be centering around cataclysmic and mass events causing mass deaths caused by natural disasters. And my understanding has been that natural disasters and cataclysmic events like hurricanes and earth traumas didn't happen before man existed.
Yeah.
That the earth was perfect and beautiful and everything functioned properly, and after the fall and with Noah and the flood, that the flood itself caused a lot of nature to change and all of those cataclysmic natural things to start affecting Earth. And so I'd like your thought on that. My other observation is that I think that we would all agree that when a tsunami takes out thousands or tens of thousands of lives, or any natural disaster takes away thousands of lives, I think we would all agree that we stop and we think about our mortality, we stop and think about the fragility of our own lives. And I would beg to differ that it doesn't matter if it's one tragic death or 10,000 tragic deaths. We stop, if that has personally touched our lives, we think about our own mortality and what God means to us and our own eternity, and so therefore it would not be pointless.
Yeah, well, I think, in that sense, you could say there's a silver lining of some sort, but I would not want to intimate that the silver lining becomes a justification for the tsunami. Something good may come out of all kinds of bad things, but that doesn't even out the balance at all. With regards to the first comment, I think that there are differences of opinion among Christians in this regard. If I look at the natural, there is a way of telling the story in which everything was super until the fall. We didn't have any kind of natural disasters. And then because of the fall, and then maybe natural changes that came to the globe as a result of a global flood, then all of these things became factors, okay? The scripture does not state that that's the case. This is a way of explaining things that might be true, but we want to be careful that we don't give divine authority to that accounting because the scripture doesn't state it. I'm personally not at all convinced that the scripture teaches a global flood. That is, the entire earth was covered with water. I have no reason from the text to believe that. Sometimes when it says the whole world was affected, they don't mean the whole entire globe. The word is very flexible and it's used in different ways. And even within the account itself, I think it can be demonstrated that a localized flood is certainly possible, and that was the point of the judgment anyway. It was a judgment upon the human beings that lived in that area, which was all of humanity, save those 8 who was killed and those survived. So if it was a local flood, then this doesn't serve to explain how the planet itself started its changes and upheavals. That's possible, but I don't think it's necessary from the text. And when I think of things like, plate tectonics and the like, these all strike me as being design features. When you said, well, before the fall, everything was just the way God wanted it, I think this was part of the way God wanted it. The balance of nature and the way everything blends together and accomplishes certain tasks and ends are things that we can point to as design features of the world, the planet, that intimates the existence of God. God is working in these things. And so I don't have any reason to think that the system of the earth wasn't operating that way before the fall. I think it probably was. I could be mistaken about that, so I'm open to the alternative. But I kind of think we should be careful about not being too dogmatic about some of these things because it could be otherwise. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the time that we spent together. I hope that some things that I said got you thinking. That was my goal tonight.